Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Dr. Brad Roberts, the Director of the Center for Global Security Research, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to today's session on a new nuclear policy for the Biden administration with our speaker, Tom Kalina. Let me say a few words to set some context before we turn it over to Tom. Every president since the end of the Cold War has arrived with the ambition to take dramatic steps to reduce nuclear dangers. In fact, that could probably be said of just about each and every president of the nuclear era. The president I served, President Obama, believed many practical steps could be taken to move away from Cold War thinking and to make meaningful progress toward the long-term disarmament goal. The president who preceded him was cool to arms control, in part because he was impatient to move, as he put it, nuclear weapons out of the foreground and into the background of the US-Russian relationship. He also set out a, quote, new strategic framework explicitly described as an alternative to Cold War thinking. President Biden fits well in this tradition. He arrives with a clearly stated intent to reduce the role of nuclear weapons while reestablishing U.S. arms control credentials and leadership. Now, turning these presidential aspirations into successful governance agendas has proven to be easier said than done. What looked simple from the campaign trail began to look more complicated in the Oval Office. And it's fair to say that most, if not all, presidents fell short of their ambitions. I have argued that the administration in which I served was, quote, mugged by reality, that we discovered as an administration that there had been more movement away from Cold War thinking than from outside. And we also discovered that further movement could come at the price of some other policy priorities, including strategic stability and assurance. Others, however, argued that we had simply lost our resolve in the face of reluctant Russians and combative Republicans. Coursing through this history is a long-running debate about the necessary balance between continuity and change in U.S. nuclear policy making, and about the necessary balance between political measures to reduce and eliminate threats and the military measures necessary to deter threats so long as they remain. The critics of legacy approaches argue that both balances are off today, that there has been too much continuity, not enough change, that military measures dominate at a time when political measures could do much more for us to reduce nuclear dangers. The latest major marker in this discussion is a book co-authored by today's speaker and former Secretary of Defense William Perry, entitled The Button, The New Nuclear Arms Race and Presidential Power from Truman to Trump. It conveys their thinking about the urgency of major changes to the U.S. practice of nuclear deterrence and about the availability of a suitable alternative strategy. I'm very grateful to Tom for his willingness to join us today to share this thinking and to update it in a manner that makes it relevant to the Biden administration's review of nuclear policy and posture. Tom Collina is Director of Policy at the Ploughshares Fund. For those of you who don't know the fund, it's a public grant-making foundation based in San Francisco and Washington, D.C., that supports initiatives to prevent the spread and use of nuclear weapons and to prevent the conflicts that could lead to their use. Tom joined Plowshares in 2014. Prior to that time, he had served in multiple roles in the research and advocacy community as research director of the Arms Control Association, as executive director and co-founder of the Institute for Science and International Security, and as director of the Global Security Program at the Union of Concerned Scientists. His expertise is focused on nuclear and missile defense policy and non-proliferation. And he has a bachelor's degree in international relations from Cornell University. Tom, before I turn it over to you, let me review today's rules of engagement. Tom will speak for approximately 20 to 30 minutes, and then we'll turn to roundtable discussion. I hope that you'll want to join the discussion. If so, please raise your hands electronically and I'll call upon you. If you'd rather, go ahead and send me a chat and I'll see that your question gets into play, time permitting. With that, let me thank you, Tom, for joining us on this issue, and I turn it over to you.
For inviting me. It's a true pleasure to be here. Livermore has such a proud history, and it's an honor to speak to this community. The DC policy community and the lab do not talk nearly enough, so I really value this opportunity. Many of the ideas I'll talk about today are based on the book that Brad mentioned, The Button, that I wrote, released last year with Secretary of Defense Bill Perry. And I'll be testifying next week before the Senate Armed Services Committee, so I'm hoping to get some tough questions here to help me prepare for that. So bring it on. And I also plan to keep my remarks brief so we have more time for discussion. So as Brad said, I'd like to talk today about a new policy for the Biden administration, which, as you know, and as Brad said, is starting its nuclear posture review, or NPR. And as Brad well knows, every administration since Clinton in '94 has done one of these, and President Biden will continue that tradition. So this time around, I thought I would talk about three major sets of issues that I think the Biden team will need to deal with. So the first of those is increasing presidential decision time, that is, giving the president more time to decide how he might use nuclear weapons. The second is maintaining deterrence for less cost than currently planned under the $1 trillion modernization program. And the third is the future of arms control, because we have a summit coming up next week. So let's cover each one of these in turn. So first is increasing presidential decision time. The central conclusion that came out of The Button, our book, is that U.S. nuclear policy is focused on the wrong threat. And would come as no surprise that if you focus on the wrong threat, you might get the wrong policy. And I think that's the situation here. So let me explain. U.S. nuclear policy has for decades been built on one central assumption, that Russia might launch a disarming first nuclear strike, a bolt from the blue, against the United States. And as a result, the president has sole authority to launch U.S. nuclear weapons, including hundreds of ICBMs deployed on high alert. This strategy is expensive, requiring large numbers of deployed weapons, and at the same time, Moscow makes the same assumption about Washington. Now, in the course of writing the book and looking back at the Cold War, we found no compelling evidence that either side would have ever launched a surprise attack. In short, it would have been national suicide. And as former CIA director and Defense Secretary Bob Gates said, quote, "Very few in Washington thought there was ever a remote chance that the Soviets would suicidally throw the dice that way," unquote. And Stratcom Commander Admiral Charles Richard recently said, quote, "A bolt out of the blue is unlikely." And yet US policy is geared to this unlikely threat, which means to us that US policy creates an even greater danger, the possibility that nuclear forces might be used by accident, through a political or technical miscalculation. So to us, it's high time to shift the focus of US nuclear policy to this greater danger, blundering into nuclear war by mistake. Now, as we lay out in the book, the risk of blundering into nuclear war was and is today greater than that of intentional attack. Throughout the Cold War and still today, the superpowers have been focused on the wrong threat, and we've been undermining our own security. And we must realize that a nuclear war by accident or mistake would be just as deadly as one by intent. The size and lethality of US and Russian forces ensures that a nuclear exchange, regardless of why it happens, could result in the end of our civilization, which is why we state clearly that starting a nuclear war by mistake is the greatest existential risk to the United States today. And this is not just a theoretical possibility. We came, in fact, very close to blundering into nuclear catastrophe several times during the Cold War, and I'll name just a few. Of course, the Cuban Missile Crisis, where President Kennedy did not know that Soviet tactical nuclear weapons were already on the island. This is an example of bad information that could have led to catastrophe. We've had false alarms, such as in 1979, when there was a report of a Russian surprise attack. This was a false alarm. In this case, a technician had put a simulation tape into the computer. So this was a human error situation. 1980, the very next year, again, another alert of a surprise attack. False alarm again. It was found a defective computer chip was to blame, was fixed for 46 cents. This is an example of a technical error. There have also been false alarms in Russia. And of course, if Russia feels they're being attacked, that is equally or more dangerous than if there's a false alarm here. Finally, we have to worry about unstable presidents. I'll talk a little bit about President Trump coming up here. And some have, raised concerns about him in a nuclear situation. But there have been other concerns, the most prominent being President Nixon, who was known to be unstable and drinking heavily during his impeachment process. So on top of all this, we have to add cyber threats, which is the new dimension to all this. And cyber threats to nuclear forces and warning systems increase the risk of false alarms and mistakes. But we cannot assume that cyber defenses are enough. In our view, we must respond to these threats by changing our nuclear posture and policies, because presidents simply have to assume that a nuclear attack warning is false until proven otherwise. And that has consequences on policy that we'll get to. Meanwhile, preparing for a disarming first strike, which will likely never arrive, has led us to take on dangerous policies that increase pressure on the president to make a quick decision and thus make nuclear blunder more likely. So let's turn to what the Biden administration can do to give the president more decision time while maintaining the ability to deter and respond to an intentional attack, however unlikely. So 3 things here. The first way to give the president more decision time is to end sole authority for first use. The last weeks of President Trump's term in office demonstrated the extreme danger of giving one person, the president, unilateral authority to launch nuclear weapons. In a state of emotional turmoil, as the rioters invaded the Capitol on January 6th, the president could have ordered the use of nuclear weapons. The danger was perceived to be so acute that House Speaker Nancy Pelosi actively looked for ways to prevent, quote, the unstable president from accessing the launch codes and ordering a nuclear strike, unquote. Now, we may like to think that the military would not follow a launch order from an unstable president, but ultimately the stakes are too high for hope to be our only safeguard. And I'm not saying that President Trump ever considered launching nuclear weapons on or around January 6th. I have no idea, but he sure could have. And so we need to ask ourselves, is it worth the risk? And I would say clearly not. Sole authority no longer serves U.S. interests because the main benefit of that policy, quick launch, is outweighed by the risks of accidental or mistaken launch. Moreover, sole authority is not necessary for deterrence, which is assured by U.S. nuclear-armed submarines at sea. There is no realistic threat of a bolt from the blue, and we can maintain deterrence without sole authority. We just don't need it. Now, some will say that sole authority, without sole authority, the president could not respond quickly. And that is true, and that is actually the point. We do not need to respond quickly. And in fact, a quick decision increases the chances of starting war in error. To quote former Secretary of Defense Jim Mattis from the Trump administration, an enemy attack does not condemn us to immediate or emotional reaction. It should be a studied, deliberate process, unquote. So the Biden administration can end sole authority for first use in 2 ways. The president can share that authority with Congress, either all of Congress or a subset, and there's legislation to that effect in Congress today. Or the president can declare that the U.S. would only use nuclear weapons in retaliation, and there's legislation along those lines as well. Such policies would provide clear directives to the military to follow. A launch could be legally ordered by the president only if the nation had been attacked with nuclear weapons, or if Congress had approved the decision, providing, in my view, a necessary constitutional check on executive power. Both would be infinitely less risky than our current doctrine. So the second way the president can get more decision time is to declare sole purpose. Now, in my view, the United States should never initiate nuclear war, but only use these weapons to deter or respond to a nuclear attack against us or our allies. With US conventional superiority, no president should use nuclear weapons first in any scenario. Against a nuclear armed state like Russia or China, first use would invite a devastating retaliation. And against a non-nuclear state, first use would go against 50 years of US non-proliferation policy. We simply cannot convince other states that they do not need nuclear weapons if the United States itself says it needs them for non-nuclear threats. Now, the Biden campaign has stated, quote, that the sole purpose of the US nuclear arsenal should be deterring and, if necessary, retaliating against a nuclear attack. As president, Biden will work to put that belief into practice in consultation with our allies and military. And I fully agree with President Biden on this point. And regardless of what this policy is ultimately called, sole purpose, no first use, or something else, such a policy should do three things. It should clearly prohibit the United States from starting a nuclear war. It should rule out preemptive nuclear attacks, which have a high risk of starting a nuclear war by mistake and should not be considered under any circumstances. And three, it should prohibit launch on warning of nuclear weapons, since such launches increase the risk of starting a nuclear war in response to a false alarm. And I'll talk about that more in a minute. So establishing a sole purpose policy will clearly require consultations with allies. And I fully understand that given the damage of the Trump administration, a lot of work needs to be done rebuilding alliances. But allies don't get to have a veto over US nuclear policy. So the Biden administration will need to work with allies to reassure them that a policy of sole purpose does not undermine Washington's commitment to their security, and I think that can be done. So the third way to give the president more decision time is to take land-based ballistic missiles, ICBMs, off alert. If early warning sensors indicate that enemy missiles are on their way to the United States, the president would have to consider launching ICBMs before those enemy missiles arrive, known as launch on warning. And once the ICBMs are launched in retaliation on our side, they cannot be recalled. They cannot be destroyed in flight. The president would have less than 10 minutes to make this terrible decision. In such a situation, a president will be under great pressure to, as we say, use them or lose them and launch ICBMs before the attack can be confirmed on US soil. If the president orders a launch and the attack turns out to be a false alarm, the president would have started nuclear war by mistake. To me, that's the ultimate nightmare that we should be trying to prevent. So ICBMs on high alert are a nuclear catastrophe waiting to happen. And we should take ICBMs off alert and end the policy of launch on warning. So let me shift for a second to the question of the modernization program and how we can maintain deterrence for less. Because buying the president more decision time does not mean we should stop deterring a possible intentional attack. As long as that threat remains, we need to address it. But intentional attack should not be the primary focus, as I've mentioned, and we can deter it for less money than we are planning to spend right now. So deterrence depends on a credible second strike capability, which is provided by US nuclear armed submarines at sea backed up by nuclear armed bombers. The US can and should move to a sole purpose deterrence only in nuclear posture. The United States does not need ICBMs to deter nuclear war. One way to think about this is to ask ourselves, would Russia feel less deterred from attacking the United States if there were no ICBMs? And the answer is clearly not, given US submarines at sea. There is no way the Russians could eliminate that danger, and therefore no way for the Russians to reassure themselves that they could survive such an attack, even without ICBMs. Moreover, the Biden administration can make a sole purpose policy more credible and further reduce the risk of accidental launch by retiring the ICBMs. They are most likely to be used first in response to a false alarm. They are highly unlikely to be used in retaliation, as most would be destroyed in any Russian nuclear attack against the United States. Thus, ICBMs really have no logical role in US nuclear policy and would have no place in a Biden administration that adheres to a sole purpose deterrence only policy. So the Biden administration can, and in my view, should cancel the Ground-Based Strategic Deterrent program and save much of the $264 billion lifetime cost. At a minimum, the GBSD program should be delayed while the administration develops its goals for arms control talks with Russia. Now, in the meantime, the Biden administration can refurbish the existing Minuteman III missiles for at least another 20 years at a fraction of the cost of buying a new ICBM. Now, I know the Air Force disputes that. I'm happy to address that in Q&A, but for now, let me just make 3 points. The Navy is extending the life of the Trident II missile for up to 95 years, and I see no reason why the Air Force can't do something similar. The Air Force has in fact stated that the Minuteman III life extension is possible, another round of life extension. Now, the Air Force is claiming that extending the life of Minuteman III would be more expensive than building a new missile, and that cost estimate is simply flawed, as I'm happy to talk about later. Lastly, let me talk about the future of arms control. President Biden and Putin will meet next week in Geneva. They have already taken a huge step by extending the New START treaty in the very first weeks of the Biden administration, a tremendously important step that was essential to keep the arms control process going. There was a very real possibility that the whole process would collapse under the Trump administration, and I'm very appreciative and grateful to the Biden administration for keeping the process going by extending New START. So we now have bought ourselves another 5 years. The treaty will expire in 2026, but it cannot be extended again. So the question is, what comes next? And I would like to see the next agreement do 3 things. First, it should cover, cap, and reduce all US and Russian nuclear weapons. That means strategic and tactical, which, as you know, would be a major step beyond previous treaties, which have covered strategic weapons, but not tactical weapons. Now, if the US wants to convince Russia to cover its larger stockpile of tactical weapons, the Russians are going to ask for something in return. And it's likely going to be for limits on US strategic missile defenses, which I would urge the Biden administration to be open to and to explore with the Russians. And the ways to do that would be to not expand the missile defense system, the strategic defense system that is deployed on the West Coast, primarily in Alaska, and to find a way, this won't be easy, but to find a way to limit Navy Aegis ships that carry SM-3 interceptors. The Russians are going to be worried about both of those systems, and we'll have to find a way to limit both of those systems. Third, as much as there's a lot of concern about China these days, and any country that has 300 nuclear weapons we should be concerned about. But bringing China into this arms control process, I don't think at this point makes any sense. They don't want to be part of it right now. Their arsenal, as I said, 300 nuclear weapons is of course a concern, but we have more than 10 times that many. And so the Chinese are saying, come talk to us when you've reduced your forces significantly. People are saying that the Chinese are dramatically increasing their forces. Maybe. Let's see where that goes. Even if they double their forces, it won't be anywhere near what we have. So I don't think we're ready for bringing China into the arms control process, unless it's part of a strategic security dialogue, but not an arms reduction process. So let me conclude by saying that these 2 principles, reducing the risk of accidental war and maintaining deterrence for less cost, translate into clear policy priorities for the Biden administration. The United States should seek to increase presidential decision time by ending the current policies of sole authority, first use and ICBMs on high alert, and to maintain deterrence for less cost the United States should cancel the Ground-Based Strategic Deterrent. And by making these important policy shifts, the Biden administration can save hundreds of billions of dollars that can be redirected to more pressing needs and at the same time reduce the risk of nuclear war. So thank you for your patience, for your attention, and I look forward to any questions you may have.
Thanks, Tom.